Hey guys, we're going to talk today about how new species arise as allele frequency changes over time kind of pile up on themselves. So this process of creating new species is called speciation. And in order for this to occur, members of the same species must be isolated from each other somehow. Okay, and it can be in a variety of ways. All right, and there's two main ways that we then kind of course, break up into a bunch of smaller ways. So the first way is called prezygotic isolation. All right, so that's zygotic, just like zygote, right? Which remember is the first cell that is created when egg and sperm fuse. So pre meaning before. So this is basically they're isolated and cannot reproduce before they even can create a zygote. Before they can even make an attempt at reproduction, they are isolated and cannot do so. All right, and then we have three types of prezygotic isolation. Remember, this is preventing them from even mating or attempting to mate at all. Okay, so our first one is called temporal. And temporal is a word you sometimes will see, but it always is kind of referring to the same thing, which is time. Okay, so they're isolated in time. Okay, so a lot of times this has to do with just individual preference that kind of gets compounded over time. So maybe within a certain species of birds, some of them like to wake up earlier in the morning, some of them like to sleep in a little bit later, right? As human beings, that kind of would make sense to us. So those birds that are up earlier are interacting with each other, and those birds that stay up later are interacting with each other. And so they might not be active at the same time, and if they're not active at the same time, they're probably not going to be mating with each other either. Or sometimes instead of throughout the day, it is some might be more likely to, be reproductively receptive earlier in the season, and others are more reproductively active later in the season. And again, if they're not reproductively active at the same time in the same part of the season, they're not going to reproduce with each other. So we have this isolation by time. All right, second time is behavioral isolation. And this can kind of be considered, or temporal could be considered a type of behavioral isolation because they're, choosing to behave at different times. But I've seen lots of, again, mostly these studies are with birds because they're very, very easy to observe and have clear reproduction patterns, and the males and females are easy to tell apart. But there's some that, some different females prefer different songs. Okay, and so they're all kind of creating different reproductive groups based on which songs they prefer. Or what dances they prefer, because some male birds dance for other birds. So there's lots of ways behavior can kind of create distinct reproductive groups within a species as well that kind of serves to isolate them from each other. Again, this is prezygotic, so this would be before a zygote is even made. They're not reproducing. All right, and then the third, which is the most clear cut, is geographical. Okay, and so geography, right? So there's lots and lots of examples of this, but the idea is they're in physically different places, and so they are not going to reproduce with each other. Okay, so really classic example of this, if you don't know, Florida panthers, mountain lions, pumas, there's a C word for it, I'm not going to think of it, but they're all exactly the same species. Okay, so if they got together, they could successfully reproduce. Okay, but especially this group, there's a group of those animals down in the tip of Florida. And there are none of them in the rest of the South. okay? So those ones that are down in Florida are not going to reproduce this with the ones out in Wyoming, Colorado, out in the Rocky Mountains. They are nowhere close to each other, right? They're geographically isolated. And the likelihood that one Florida panther is going to mosey up to the Panhandle or Wyoming and find a mountain lion to mate with is pretty far-fetched, right? So they're isolated from each other. They're not reproducing. And the Florida panthers, since they are geographically isolated from all the other members of that same species, have some allele frequencies that are different than the rest of the species, right? So they're not even technically a subspecies because they're still the same. They would look the same and behave the same. But again, if they stay isolated for thousands and thousands of years, their allele frequencies are probably going to change enough that they might become a separate species. All right, so that's prezygotic. Okay, preventing or ways to isolate groups within a species before a zygote even forms. So, our second method must be post-zygotic. All right, so post always means after. So this is after the zygote forms. So a male and female are able to get together. They're able to reproduce, kind of. They create a zygote. Okay, but then there's no possibility that that zygote will then fully grow up, develop, and create offspring of its own. Okay, so we have, there's really two of these, but I'm going to kind of zero in, or sorry, there's really three, but we're going to just talk about two. So the first one is hybrid inviability. Okay, and this is what we call it when they can create a zygote, so they can create that very first cell of a new organism, but then that zygote is unable to properly go through mitosis and develop into a baby of whatever species we're talking about. So the zygote can be made, but it can't even develop properly enough to get born. So it's not even going to get born, so obviously it's not going to pass on its own genes. And then the second one is hybrid infertility, which I always really like to talk about when I'm just defining a species to start with, is, yes, the offspring, the zygote is created, the offspring develops in the womb, the offspring is born, but it can't produce functional gametes of its own, so it can't produce. So this is the classic example we've talked about, which is mules. Right? Remember, mules being the offspring of a horse and a donkey. Right? So obviously the horse and the donkey were able to get together. They were able to make a zygote. But after that, the hybrid that they create is infertile. So they're not going to work. Right? They're not going to have gene flow between those two organisms. Okay. So this was a term that I kind of had a functional idea of. I don't know if I've ever applied this term to it. But we have this concept of ecological equivalence. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Okay, so if two things are equivalent, that just means they're basically the same. And ecological is talking about environments. So these are things in different places, different environments, that are pretty much doing the same thing. They fill similar niches. Okay, so why would we have ecological equivalence? Okay, why would we have similar animals, similar species filling similar niches in similar places? Because similar places have similar niches, and the best suited organisms are going to develop to fill those niches. So a really good example is if we're talking about emus, rays, and ostriches. Okay. And you're probably familiar with emus and ostriches, but rays are very, very, very similar. I think they're a little bit smaller. But all all three of these are large flightless birds. They all nest on the ground. They all are fast. So how can they all exist? Remember, we have competitive exclusion principle, which would say no two species can fill the same niche. But also in the competitive exclusion says in the same place. Okay? So these three species are filling similar niches, but they're not in the same place. They live in different places. Okay? Their ranges don't overlap. Emus are native to Africa. Okay? Oops. That's not what I meant. This is supposed to be ostriches. Ostriches are native to Africa, emus are native to Australia, and rays are native to South America. So competitive exclusion doesn't come in here because they are in different places. And you will find ecological equivalents all over the world, right? So similar species filling similar niches, but in different parts of the world. Okay. All right. So the concept of evolution has been pretty much accepted by the scientific community for quite a long time, since like the 1900s, like early 1900s. But remember, the concept of evolution starts with a living thing, a living thing being changed over time. But they could not figure out or agree on where they think the first living thing came from, right? They're like, okay, so after living things exist, natural selection makes sense, we can get different species, that makes sense, but they couldn't figure out where the first species came from. So we have one really famous example or experiment, Stanley Miller. You might see it described as the Miller-Urey experiment, because he was also working with another scientist. But he, in glassware, okay, replicated the conditions of early Earth. Okay, so no life. It was a sterile environment. It had carbon dioxide mostly for an atmosphere. It had water. It had ammonia. It had all of these substances that would have existed on really early Earth before life existed, okay? And nothing happened until he added a spark to his system, which would have replicated lightning of storms. And there's no reason for us to believe that lightning did not exist on early Earth. So this, again, makes sense. This is still recreating conditions of early Earth. And in a very short amount of time, like days, okay, within days, he was able to recreate molecules essential to life. Okay, so things that are needed for life to exist naturally would start to exist given the molecules that would have been available to early Earth. So most scientists believe, and they can kind of recreate parts of this process, that once these kinds of molecules existed, right, so amino acids and lipids and things like that, they might naturally form spheres over time. Okay, so think about this. If you blow bubbles, what shape do they take? They take a sphere, right? So they kind of would naturally arrange themselves into cell-like shapes. And again, it doesn't have to really be a living thing right away, right? It can kind of slowly get there over millions of years through happenstance and chance, and it only has to functionally happen one time in the entire planet over thousands and millions of years. So hopefully you can buy that. All right. All right, and we're just going to do this one more page today. Key idea, key idea, key idea. Evolution is not over. Okay, scientists can observe allele frequency changing right now. And remember, the concept is if the allele frequencies change for long enough, then we can develop noticeable changes. If that happens long enough, we can create new species. There's one really, really famous example of kind of seeing this in action. There's a couple whose last name was Grant. And they essentially went to this island and studied the one species of finch that existed there. And they kept track of every individual bird on this island. Okay, it was a pretty small island. And they observed closely their bird songs, the bird's behavior, and again, there was just this one species of finch that they were really, really following. And they observed that song patterns started to change. Okay, kind of a new bird showed up on the island, started crossbreeding with a few of the other birds, and we developed two distinct groups who liked different songs. Okay, and throughout their study, again, they lived on this island for years and years and years. And it got to be the point where they preferred different songs for long enough that they started to look different, they started to behave different, and we had two separate species starting to emerge. Okay? And this is all natural. Like, they weren't manipulating this at all. This just happened, and they caught it in the act. They caught evolution happening, and they were able to observe it directly. So another, classic example we can observe right away is bacteria. Okay, they're constantly changing and evolving and changing their allele frequencies to be able to survive in different situations, especially when exposed to antibiotics, right? So remember, if we think about evolution as a change in allele frequency, so if we had 1 million bacteria and an antibiotic kills 950,000 of them, we're left with 50,000 that have an allele that makes them more successful against antibiotic. And then they will reproduce, and that allele for being resistant to antibiotics is now more common. Bam, evolution has happened. Okay. So last topic of the day, we have various ways we can talk about the rates of evolution, how fast it happens. And there was debate, again, this is one of those things where there were arguments among scientists for years and years about which one of these is correct. And kind of the consensus now is that they're both correct sometimes, right? So it kind of depends on what's happening in the world, in the environment, which one of these rates is happening. So the first one is called gradualism. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It is gradual, right? It is slow, it's steady, it is gradual. Okay, so things can happen really, really slowly if the environment is not changing very much. Okay, so there's not a huge pressure on the species to change, and so it's probably not going to change very fast, right? So probably there's still some the competition between members of the species, but it's not very fierce, right? Maybe a lot of the species can kind of reproduce fairly readily. So the species is still, we're still going to have evolution, we're still going to have change, it's just really, really, really slow. Okay, so kind of the hallmark of times when gradualism was happening is you're going to see lots and lots of fossils of intermediate species, right? So as the species are changing, we're going to try to be able to find fossil evidence of every step along the way. Because it's so slow, there is a greater chance that each step is going to have fossil evidence. Okay, so there's really, really, great examples of gradualism in the precursors to horses, the precursors to humans. Lots and lots of dinosaur fossils that show a gradualism because we can see kind of, this changed, and then the skull changed a little bit, then the skull changed a little bit more. And then we have the alternative, which is punctuated equilibrium. Okay, and so this is faster. Okay, so the opposite is true. So gradualism was slow because conditions were pretty stable. Punctuated equilibrium is going to be fast because conditions are changing. Okay, so the species has to keep up with a changing environment. So why would the environment change quickly? All right, so things like massive natural disasters, like if lots of volcanoes erupt in a short amount of time, the climate gets colder for years and years. That's going to be a changing environment. Say a giant meteor strikes the planet and wipes out a huge portion of the population. That's going to be a changing environment. So things are changing much, much faster. So you can kind of think of the species competition being turned up to 11. Right? So maybe in gradualism, a large percentage of the population is able to reproduce each generation. Right? So most of the alleles go on generation after generation after generation. In punctuated equilibrium, the species is put through a much narrower funnel. Right? A smaller percentage of the population is going to be successful, and so only a small fraction of the alleles go on to the next generation, and so we're going to have an allele frequency change that's much more rapid. Okay, so you may not be able to find as much or as many fossils of those intermediate species, those in-between species, because the species changed so much faster. And remember, less than 0.1% of all living things, much, much less than a tiny fraction of a percentage of living things are fossilized. Okay, most things that die do not become fossils. So if evolution is going fast, we might not get to find evidence of all of those intermediates. Okay, so a smaller percentage of each generation is, I'm going to say, reproductively successful. Than in gradualism, because we have a relatively fast version of natural selection. All right, so that is today's notes. I think we should be able to finish up in one more lecture. So we can look forward to that. See you later.